Good day, everybody, and welcome. My name is Brad Steele. I'm the Senior Director of Unified Communications at the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and a past president of NASTD. NASTD is made up of technology professionals serving state government. It is a member-driven organization whose purpose is to advance and promote the effective use of information technology and services to improve the operation of state government. When I was president a couple of years ago, I was reading through the Constitution for NASTD and saw that Article 1 of the NASTD Constitution, Section 2, Purpose and Goals. The second goal listed is to engage in programs for the training, education, and development of technology professionals from all areas of state government. So in reading that, we decided while I was president to put together a set of educational videos, what we've been calling the IT 101 series, to help with some education of some either understood or new technology. So we've asked our industry professionals, our corporate affiliate community, to work with us. I get together with them and I ask 10 standard questions about a technology or service that is the topic for that week. So if you haven't seen these videos that we put together in the past, I ask you to refer to the NASTD website, and you'll see a link to our YouTube channel where you can find all the videos. We've done quite a few of them at this point. So, and for this particular session, our subject is DevSecOps and its part in the development process. So, I definitely couldn't speak for more than about 30 seconds on the subject, so that's why we bring in professionals from our corporate community. So for this session, we brought in Rajesh Jaluka, and he is the Chief Technology Officer for U.S. Public Markets at Kyndryl. He advises customers on accelerating their digital journey for better business outcomes and user experiences. He loves solving puzzles, and his latest addiction are Wordle and Quirtle. Welcome, Rajesh.
Thank you, Brad.
So, it's funny you talk about Wordle. I have yet to play Wordle on my own, but I also often get asked from my sons and my wife when they get stuck on that fifth word. They're always coming to me. So maybe I'll be calling you if I get stumped. So the topic for this series is DevSecOps. So can you just give us a quick overview? What is DevSecOps and why should organizations in state government be concerned about it?
Yeah, sure. So the DevOps movement has been around for a while now, right? And essentially the idea of DevOps was we had devs sitting in one silo building applications, and they would throw the application over to the operations teams and they have to figure out how to run it. And the whole idea of DevOps was to sort of bring down that wall, and organizations are already seeing the benefit in bringing Agile together. How do you accelerate? But in that whole paradigm shift, security was still someone else's problem or maybe no one's problem. And so the question was like, how do we resolve that? And so the whole idea of DevSecOps is really think about security as a built-in construct, built into everything, and make it sort of everyone's responsibility. And with the DevSecOps, the idea is, can we engineer all the security requirements into the product in the development stage? Obviously, we can't do everything at the beginning, but the idea is that with each iteration we mature, and can we take more and more security from the ops or from security team giving instruction manuals to now everything as code, right? So you probably also hear people referring to the same approach as shift left. So the idea is that now instead of leaving it towards the end, we keep shifting all the security related activities more towards the development. And that's really the whole idea of DevSecOps. And the reason, I think the second part of your question was, why should organizations care? And primarily, when you look at security, when breaches happen, there is definitely a revenue impact. So if you're a retailer or e-tailer, and if your site goes down, you lose traffic, you lose revenue. But then the cost of repair, because not only you lost the revenue, but maybe some data was stolen. Now you have to give them, all the customers, a free credit check, some kind of, you may have to be responsible for paying them. So the cost of repair can be exorbitant. And then there is the damage to your reputation, right? Like, do I trust this company to take my business to, right? So it's sort of, when you look at all of that, reputation, cost, revenue, all of that is why organizations should care about DevSecOps.
And I'm sure that by putting security in that process, it also speeds up the release process, right? Where you don't have to have people develop a bunch of things, try and put them into production, and then, oh, by the way, now security comes in and tells you 10 reasons why you have to rebuild it. So if you have them involved early on, helps with that.
Yeah, and I think that's a common misconception. People think, hey, I'm agile, I want to get this feature out the door quickly, and security is slowing me down. But in reality, if you're leaving it all towards the operations, it will slow down because you're still relying on manual processes. It's a trade-off. Now you're sacrificing and saying, okay, instead of 5 features, I'm going to have 4 features, and the 5th one will be security. So you're reducing the number of bells and whistles you're building, but at the same time, now you're speeding up your time to market, because now people don't have to do things manually.
Excellent. All right, so now that we know what it is, what should organizations be aware of when they start down the implementation process of DevSecOps?
So many times I think organizations get sort of worried and think about, we have to do a lot of things, right? But when you look at the headlines in the news, you see that there was this SolarWinds attack, or you see all these cloud providers getting impacted, or the government, or even like the White House in March, they were talking about how Russia is sort of targeting or planning to make many of these attacks. If you really go below the headline, what you'll find is majority of these attacks are actually exploiting simple weaknesses, right? Like maybe poor passwords, which are easy to guess, or these phishing emails that you get and you click, and then all of a sudden you're sort of given the keys to the kingdom, right? So essentially what organizations really need to think about is that there are a lot of sort of low-hanging, easy things that can be addressed to improve your security posture. And like anything, it all starts with people, process, technology, right? So with people, you think about culture. I mean, one of the things that you always see is that when we talk about security, you'll always find some resistance, right? Because like you were saying earlier, right? It slows me down. It's an overhead. It's expensive. So having the basic education and educating the teams as to, yes, it could be time consuming and expensive, but then there are so many easy things that can reduce your risk significantly. I think having that education helps overcome that culture barrier. And then also closing the skill gap. I mean, I think many times you see the resistance is because people don't know what to do or how to do it. So again, having that ongoing education on not only why security is important, but also how to actually do it. The second part of the people I see is sort of psychological barrier, where this whole idea of zero trust, that I can't trust anyone, because many times we are used to where, hey, I'm going to give access to all my team members. They work with me, right? So what's the problem? And many times that thinking of who do I trust or who do I not trust, or start with not trusting anyone, building the framework for implementing security, that is a hard concept for people to sort of embed. And I think employee turnover, which goes back to the skill, we host CIO exchanges. We hear from a lot of CIOs that I think every CIO is talking about, the employee turnover, and they are losing skilled resources. So again, maybe they're thinking about public-private partnership and how that can maybe help. And quickly on the process part, again, instead of thinking of security as something separate, how do we embed the security practices into your entire lifecycle process? And finally, on the technology, the applications before, like I started as mainframe programmer, it's just one COBOL program, you're done. Then you have this 2-tier architecture, 3-tier architecture, but now look at the modern cloud apps. There are so many tiers, right? So securing the modern applications are very complex, right? Technically challenging. So people really have to think in terms of how do we build a blueprint of implementing security into the systems that we are building.
Okay. So once we've defined those drivers and kind of identified those barriers that we have, how do we get started in the DevSecOps journey?
So again, going back to the culture, right? So essentially, first thing is is your team structure appropriate or adequate for driving this kind of transformation? So again, if you don't even have DevOps, right? We see that in many organizations, they still don't have DevOps practice. They're still not following Agile. So I think even having that cross-functional squads in place, because again, one person cannot solve security in the application. You may have database components, server components, storage network. So you really need to bring those minds together, right? So starting point to me is always building the right team structure. And then second part is we talk about education, right? So bringing the education, bringing the sort of secure engineering practice into the culture where everyone now knows what does secure coding mean. If I'm writing a Java program, if I'm writing a front end, I should know that these are some validations I have to do, right? These are potential ways attackers would use the system. So even having that basic understanding of how do I build, how do I test, that's important. Third step would be just hygiene, like vulnerability management that we have in place. That's again the major areas that attackers exploit. Like you don't have the right patches, you haven't hardened your system, means like password length or certain policies. So just tightening that vulnerability management goes a long way. And then we start going into the true DevSecOps, where start creating that foundation where we start integrating things like, let's say, code scans, right? So the first thing you do is the code that's being written, even by third party, is that safe, right? So instead of manually running the scans, how do you integrate that into your DevOps pipeline, or doing like image scanning, things like those. And then having a good risk management sort of practice where you really need to think about, are we doing code reviews? Are we even creating a threat model, right? Which is even saying, what are my potential threats? Because each customer and enterprise is different. And really people need to sit down and say, what are my potential sort of threat actors? What are my potential threat surfaces? And if that actually happens, what's the cost to our organization? So you really want to understand the risk before you just go out and start building, right? Because you may be risk tolerant in certain areas, so you don't want to spend the time. And then the last part I would say is having a good data governance is critical because it's all about data, right? All the attackers are basically out there not only to bring the systems down, but they want to steal your data, they want to encrypt the data so they can collect the ransomware money. So having a good data governance where you classify and say what data is of value to me, what data is sensitive, and then building the appropriate controls around based on that classification around the data, making sure you're having the right level of access for the data.
And as you go through that process, I'm sure there's a need to have a constant revision and a constant review, right? So as the threat changes or the threats in the world change, that you're constantly addressing and changing your code as well.
Yeah, I mean, the threat is evolving and, threat actors are getting more sophisticated. We uncover vulnerabilities almost every day. And even your business is dynamic, right? You're like, during the pandemic, a lot of hospitals, for example, they were not seeing patients remotely. And now all of a sudden they had to do remote. So every organization is sort of adapting. And now by virtue of that, you end up maybe creating some additional vulnerabilities. So yes, this is, you're not like, it's not a one-time exercise. It's something that needs to be ongoing.
All right. So in listening to what you're saying and everything, I do hear a lot of similar information between the different development ideologies. So what differentiates DevSecOps from similar development practices?
So, and they're sort of complementary, and they need to be really looked at as one. Many times organizations say, okay, I'm doing Agile, but I'm not DevOps, or I'm DevOps, but I'm not DevSecOps. To me, we really need to think about, especially when we are talking about this digital world where everything is becoming digital, we really need to think about how do we embrace all of these concepts and not one or the other, right? So what does Agile do? Agile is more about building cross-functional teams instead of having different team members doing different things in their silo, bringing them together, having a discipline of breaking your releases into smaller releases or sprints instead of following like a waterfall method. And then when you bring in DevOps, the idea is that now with Agile, we created a new structure for the dev team, but instead of leaving the ops team aside, the DevOps is really now bring those teams closer. So, Agile DevOps become complementary. And you take it a step further with DevOps where can we even like do all the activities like even code testing, release testing, build, deployment, change, all of that into an automated fashion. So you start building these pipeline of automation, right? So true DevOps is really not just bringing the people together, but trying to sort of create a cohesive process and automation. And then DevSecOps is again going a step further and bringing security into the whole picture. So if you don't have a good Agile practice and if you're not DevOps, for you to get to DevSecOps will be difficult, right? So really need to think about all of them as things that are complementary and sort of help each other, right?
So it sounds like the security group would need to be more involved in the beginning, but are they also testing as you go?
Absolutely, right. So, and again, it's a different kind of testing. So you do things like penetration tests, so which is not a replacement for your testing, because traditional testing would do function testing, where is the feature working, whereas the penetration test would say, what are the most likelihood of attacks, and they will test just those pieces. But again, it's not a guarantee, right? They're not doing 100% test. It's all about understanding your risk and saying what risks do I want to address and catch.
Okay. So normally, this is where I ask a security question, right? I always say, what are the security concerns? This seems to be, the heart of what we're talking about, right? Security is part of the DevSecOps. So what are some of the best practices and security design lessons that we would need to take with us on our journey?
Yeah, and I think we covered many of them, right? Like first is, again, start with assume zero trust, right? And as part of that, how do you assume zero trust is even like if you don't create a threat model, you don't even know who are you protecting yourself against, right? So the threat model allows you to identify who are my potential threat actors and understand what are my targets, right? What is my system that's going to get attacked? And also going a bit deeper into what is the likelihood of that. Is it feasible, or are we just making things up? Maybe it's very hard to attack that component, right? So assessing the feasibility, assessing what is the likelihood, and then sort of quantifying the impact and say, okay, if that happens, what is the impact to me, right? So doing that. And then the other piece that I see that many organizations don't do is, again, its motivation is, can I save cost? You hear people saying, oh, I'll do DR in cloud, or can I do dev in cloud, but not prod, or I'm going to use a different kind of database, a cheaper, lower license, open source for dev, but not for production. And the problem with that approach is basically you can't recreate your problems in your dev environment if something happens, right? So maintaining parity across all environments to make sure every environment, dev, test, prod, DR, they all are identical. They don't have to be exact same size. The size could be different, but the structure, the design, the stack of the code that you're putting, they have to be identical, right? So maintaining that parity is very important. And then the third part I would say from the lessons is going back to people are exploiting simple stuff, right? So having a good tech spec to say, how are we going to harden our systems, having a consistent policy and making sure all your systems are being hardened and you're implementing those policy across all those systems. So those I would say are sort of the top three that people need to think about. And then the hygiene part we talked about, right? Like applying patches in timely manner, having a strong encryption. And then the other two I would say is that as we get into the design part, like how are you actually protecting your system once you have identified, like, do you have good intrusion prevention system? Do you have a detection response system? Do you have malware scanning? And do you have good network segmentation? I mean, again, you'll be surprised, like many customers still have like a flat network. So that's what a lot of these threat actors do. They get into your network, and then for them, it's very easy to, travel. And all of a sudden you have like, we had one customer where the malware went, and we actually did a video from the monitoring doing a playback. You could play the video and you could see in 30 minutes, how the attack spread, where it started bringing down the system. It went from 10 to 100 to 500 to 1,000, like in no time, right? So again, having good segmentation is critical.
Okay. All right. So next question is, what are the benefits of DevSecOps?
Yeah, and I think we briefly talked about like why should the organizations care, right? And I think the three main reasons to reiterate. One is the cost. When you have all these issues that are there that you uncover, the cost of fixing the defect in a production environment is significantly higher. And what we find is if you can fix the defects at the development stage, your cost is 1/6 of what it would be. So basically, you're paying 6 times if you're fixing it once something is in production. Second is the cost of your breach, right? So when this happens, that data breach is going to have your reputation harm. So, how do you lower that cost and reduce the risk? And the third part is the speed. Again, you're not doing it manually, and you're reducing the release time, and also you're reducing the cost, right? Because if someone has to take 5 hours to do it, and now through DevSecOps, you've sort of made it as code and automated, then it's probably going to take no time, or maybe the developers just have an API call they have to include into their code, or maybe just a common service that's integrated. So those are the three different, at least three benefits, I would say.
Excellent. So it sounds like this is a kind of a very fluid process. It constantly changing, as we kind of referred to before. So what are some of the major changes that have happened in this space over the last few years, and what trends should organizations start thinking about as they mature their DevSecOps adoption?
Yeah, and I think the recent SolarWinds, in fact, I have been talking to customers for several years and talking about attacks on supply chain. And it wasn't a thing, right, back like 2-3 years back, people were not really seeing that, but the recent SolarWinds event that happened last year, right, basically SolarWinds had a supplier who had someone else and someone else's code. So essentially, by not paying attention to that supply chain, this is an example of code, but in general, right, whether you have suppliers and you are using their system or integrating with their system, or it could be code. And so essentially attackers are saying, maybe you don't have a weakness in your organization, but maybe the organization you're working with has a weakness. Right? So they can use that as a way to infiltrate into your organization, right? Whether it's inserting malicious code or maybe exploiting inserting bad data into your system using the integration, because you may have certain validations the other companies you're working with may not have, and maybe that bad data could cause damage to your system, right? So attack on supply chain definitely is one of the things that we are seeing. The other thing that, again, we haven't seen a lot, but I think in future, weaponizing the AI, right? We are talking about AI machine learning. And so we will see that like ramping up, where they will, you'll have attackers writing code that is even more intelligent, right? So it's very hard for you to capture, or they will change because today many of these you rely on a signature to catch, right? And I think as they add more intelligence, it can become more evasive and more difficult to catch. And then the remote access, we are already seeing a lot of that, like business email with phishing, and remote access Trojan horses, a lot of these. These are definitely as trends we need to be aware of.
And so it sounds to me like one of the things, one of the last videos that I did, one of the last sessions that I did was on APIs and SDKs. So it sounds like you would probably need to be sure of which APIs and which SDKs you've used, so that if you see vulnerabilities or attacks happen in your supply chain, further down the road, so to speak, that you know that those vulnerabilities could hurt you. Is that something that has been seen?
Definitely, right. So again, if you have an API, like how do you trust the API, or how do you trust that the API itself? So many times we have a provider, but they give an API and we just use the API, right? But we actually don't spend the time doing a thorough testing of the API from a security perspective. We do a lot of function testing, but we really take it for granted that it's the API provider's responsibility to test. So again, not assuming anything and just doing your own due diligence and doing your own security to make sure that you're mitigating that risk.
Excellent. All right, so again, we're up to another part of the question and answer session, where I normally ask, is this a cloud technology or an on-premise technology? But that really isn't relevant here. So as I think about it and need to adapt as I go, I'm thinking about on-premise systems versus cloud-based systems. Does DevSecOps differ in those things, and are there different implementation strategies that you need to take into consideration, whether you're in the cloud or in an on-premise system?
Yeah, I mean, the principles are the same, but I think where things would be different is now as you're doing a shift left and building on-prem, it's going to take more effort, right? So let's say if you're implementing, let's say, a vault or certificate management, you have to really think about, okay, I need to do a vendor selection, I have to build the infrastructure, I have to install all these programs, I have to test and see how they work. Whereas when you're in cloud, the cloud providers are already giving you many of those services as part of their catalog. So for you using them, it's sort of fairly easy and trivial, right? It's basically using their APIs and services. So the speed at which you can actually get your DevSecOps maturity, it's much faster in the cloud. So in that sense, you'll see a difference. You're in on-prem, it's going to take a lot of time. It's going to take a lot of effort. Will require a lot of skills. Whereas when it's in cloud, you don't really have to worry about how to install Vault and how to troubleshoot. And, it all comes with the cloud. And now you just need to know how to use it.
Okay. So with the understanding that this is an ongoing journey and will likely never truly be complete, how long to get started? How long to get to a point where you can say, I'm a DevSecOps shop?
Yeah. I mean, truly you're never done in the sense that you'll always have new things in the security realm that you can sort of codify, you can harden. But at least I would say just the culture change itself, getting the teams to think, it takes, anywhere from a year to 18 months, right? So a lot of companies don't think of or underestimate the effort. They think, okay, we have conducted a training class and we are done, right? But to really get that mindset change and have people changing their behavior and making security part of their process and practice on a daily basis, getting that takes a year to 18 months for you to have in place. And then you start, building these capabilities and prioritizing. So you'll be like doing this, forever. You can never say I'm really done or I'm DevSecOps, but at least you can claim that I have a practice. I have teams that are thinking in the DevSecOps way, and they are designing, right? Whenever something new comes, maybe initially you do manually, but then they are always thinking, how do I codify this?
Okay. And then the next question is usually around the cost of what, how much something should cost, how much you should pay for it. Now, I understand that this isn't a widget, this isn't a piece of equipment, and it's not even a software or a technology. So with that in mind, I still need to budget and plan for this going forward. So what are the cost models that we should think of as we move forward into a DevSecOps environment? And what do we need to be cognizant of as we move forward?
Yeah. So I think it comes down to, how much do you need to spend, right? So you could get like a small Toyota or you could get a Cadillac. So first thing to understand is going back to the threat model, understanding what my risks are. And there is a report that IBM and other partner they had created, which talks about the average cost of breach, which is somewhere like between 3.8 million to 4, which is like a simple breach. But as the breach gets more complex, the cost goes up. So first step is really to understand what is the cost to your business, and then you need to think about a budget. And in that budget, then you can, again, if you're truly following Agile, then you need to really allocate and say, okay, how much am I going to spend, on a quarterly basis on the capabilities? And then you need to allocate like for education, so people can, again, get the right education, have the right mindset. You need to think about what is the software cost, right? Again, if you're on cloud, it's much easier to predict because many of those prices are published. So you can actually see how much we are going to consume and easier for you to budget. Budgeting on-prem becomes slightly trickier, right? Because then it depends on the license model, it depends on which product you're going to buy, what kind of hardware and software you need. But it all comes down to like prioritizing, right? So again, what are your crown jewels, right? What is your business impact? There is an organization called OWASP that publishes the top 10 vulnerabilities that attackers use. So again, using things like resources like these to say, okay, what should I prioritize, and then budget it accordingly.
Excellent. Well, we've come to the end. I told you this would be relatively painless. So my last question that I ask every time, what else do I need to know? What have I forgotten to ask you about?
No, I think you pretty much covered almost everything, right? I would say, but I think I just want to reiterate on the culture part, right? Where it's the organizations, how are they organizing their people? And many times, when I talk about DevOps or DevSecOps, people also translate that and say, hey, we are not doing application development, right? So that might be something to think about, that it's not that whether you're doing application development, you could be just doing some integration, or you could be maybe using a lot of SaaS products. Even for SaaS products, you really need to think about how much is it applicable? Because when you look at a cloud provider, they have this matrix. They say, this is our responsibility, and this is your responsibility. Same with SaaS. They are responsible for the infra, the app, but data is still your responsibility, right? So you really need to think about, regardless of what your organization's model is for consuming IT, you need to think about where does the responsibility of the provider end, and where does my responsibility start?
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Once again, I find myself smarter at the end of these, at least seemingly, and having learned a lot. I hope that folks that are watching get as much out of this as I did. So once again, I would like to thank Rajesh Jaluka, Chief Technology Officer for U.S. Public Markets at Kyndryl. And, thank you for your time, and thank you for being flexible with the scheduling. We had to bounce this a couple of times, and I appreciate your ability to stick with me.
Yeah, no, thank you, Brad, for this opportunity. I enjoyed the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. And for those of you watching, we have the Eastern Region seminar coming up very shortly in Philadelphia, and look forward to seeing you all either there or in August at the annual event. So thank you all very much, and have a great day.
Thank you.